am Lauren from RDU on Stage, and I am with Jerome Davis, the artistic director of Burning Coal Theater, and Diana Wynn, who is with the League of Women Voters of Wake County. And I am just so thrilled to be with both of you this evening on it's kind of a historic day and a historic year. So it's very exciting. Thank you for being with me.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for doing this, Lauren.
I'm very excited. I've been interviewing the playwrights, and their enthusiasm for this project is infectious, and I want to dive into the project. But before we do, um, Diana, I want to ask you. It's been a fairly newsworthy day. Joe Biden announced his running mate, Kamala Harris. So, talk to me about the significance of this selection for VP. I know League of Women Voters, as we talked about before, is a nonpartisan organization, but it's a historic day, I feel like, for women and particularly women of color. Are we ready to have a woman of color as our vice president?
Sure. I do want to make clear we are nonpartisan, and that means that we never have, we do not, and never will endorse candidates for election at any level. But and to your question, it is a historic year, and I think that we're here talking about the centennial of the 19th Amendment, where women won the fight for the vote, and then today, in the very month that is the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, we have the announcement today of the very first woman of color on the ticket as a vice president this year, and yes, it is historic. And you asked me, are people ready? Yes, I think they're ready, and I think that when people go vote, my hope is that they'll vote for any of the candidates based on their merits. And certainly, we've long had women who had the accomplishments. I think that it's particularly important that we recognize that while women are a little over the majority of the voters, both in North Carolina and in the U.S., women do not hold half the elected offices at any given level. And so to have this announcement today is important for all sorts of reasons.
So, for folks not paying attention, we are less than 198, 97. I don't know, I've lost count, but less than 100 days from the election. What are some of the key issues, Diana, facing North Carolinians in this election that people need to really be aware of, no matter what side of the party line they're on?
Yeah, the league is nonpartisan, but we do take positions on issues. We just approach them in a nonpartisan way, and we think there are a lot of important issues. And obviously, the individual voter has their own priorities, and they should vote based on the issues that are important to them. Remember that we're in a census year right now, and the census is critically important for a lot of reasons, but one of those reasons is that every 10 years, all the states engage in redistricting or redrawing all of the voting districts for congressional and legislative districts, and that is based on census data. So in about a year from now, a little less, our legislature should be redrawing those voting lines. I think a lot of voters are concerned about the gerrymandering that has been going on here in the state for a very long time, and that is a critically important issue. You need to ask your candidates what their position is. You need to vote on the issues that impact you, whether that's health care, affordable housing, and certainly given in the midst of a pandemic, all of the other issues that have become heightened, access to affordable health care, and then of course the economy. The economy is in a condition that we had not anticipated right before cities and communities started shutting down. So there are lots of issues that people need to be paying attention to, and a pandemic has certainly heightened the need to pay attention to a lot of those issues.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of great resources, I will say, on the League of Women Voters website, the League of Women Voters Wake County website, and I will put the links to the websites when I repost the video.
Yeah, the best place, so we have voting information always on our website at lwvwake.org, but the League of Women Voters owns and operates a separate platform called vote411.org. So it's vote411.org. It's devoted entirely to election information. It's a national website. And here in Wake County, our local league manages the parts of the website relevant to our area. So voters can go there, and it's an easy, we call it a one-stop shop. For voting information, for any information that you need about voting, including links to register, to apply for your absentee ballot. And in just a few weeks, I'd say 3 weeks or so, information on the candidates here in Wake County and at the state level will be online. So we do what we call candidate guides. We used to type them up, mail them out to the population. Now they're online, and they're on vote411.org. And that's where voters can go to get nonpartisan information about all the candidates.
I just posted that in the comments of our Facebook page, the website, so people can find it and click on it. And this is also a good time to request your absentee ballot if you're not going to be comfortable going to the polls to vote. Just a reminder, this is the time to do it. So
we're encouraging people to apply for their absentee ballot now, regardless of what they think their plans are going to be. That if you change your mind about going to the polls in person for any reason, at least you'll have an absentee ballot option. But if you don't even apply, then you won't even have that option. So we're encouraging everyone to go ahead, do it now, so we don't contribute to the postal system getting jammed up more as we get closer and closer to the deadline. But we really encourage people to go ahead and apply for that.
And it's pretty easy to do. So it should not be, it's a no-brainer. As you mentioned, this is the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. So can you talk, we're going to get into the 19th Amendment project and Burning Coal, the series of plays that you all are producing. But Diana, before we get into the 19th Amendment project, talk to me about the historical significance of celebrating this centennial during this election year and some of the events that the League of Women Voters has planned outside the 19th Amendment project.
Sure. So this is the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment, of course, is what recognized that women in this country have the right to vote. And gave the vote to women in all the states. I will say that we aren't really using the word celebrate the 19th Amendment because there are parts of the history leading up to the 19th Amendment that really aren't worth celebrating, but are worth learning about. We instead commemorate the 19th Amendment. It was an important milestone. Many of the states in the U.S. Did not give women the full franchise, and it was a 72-year-long fight to win the vote. And a lot of people don't realize how long it went on, starting with the very first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, going up to then 1920, August 1920. So this month is the true centennial. It is an important milestone in the history of suffrage for women. But I think that it's important to remember that that was not the end of the fight for women's suffrage, that in 1920, the 19th Amendment largely benefited white women. And that was particularly the case in the South, where there were all sorts of Jim Crow laws in place, like literacy tests and poll taxes and outright intimidation at the polls. So the fight for suffrage continued well into the 30s, 40s, the 50s, into the 60s. Some important legislation, and the League would argue that it continues today as we continue to fight for voting rights for all. So here we are, 100 years later. Commemorating this important milestone, but still acknowledging that there's a lot of work to do, and that there were a lot of women and men that for the past 100 years continued the fight for suffrage. It's an important year in all sorts of ways to learn about that history.
And I'm glad you brought that up because I am interviewing a lot of the playwrights, and one undercurrent of a lot of these interviews have been that the suffragette movement is, one playwright said, is rooted in racism. That's how she put it. So that's what how I'll say it. And you're saying it as well, especially in the South. So can you speak to me about this issue and the urgency that the League feels, the urgency of the intersectionality between race and gender, especially as we approach this upcoming election?
Sure. Well, I don't know if it's from our perspective, if it's about the election per se. We think that, in our advocacy work, we need to understand notions of intersectionality. And when we go back and we look at the history of the fight for women's rights in this country, it is so clear that many, I would say most, of the white women suffragists from the 1800s, the early 1900s, really did not understand the notion of intersectionality. And of course, women of color not only understood it, they lived it. And there was the marginalization of women of color in the movement. And why is that relevant today? It certainly, we see the vestiges of that even 100 years later in some of the work and organizations, to the extent to which I think people are working and collaborating together, and we can see it play out in our social justice movements, right? I wonder if there had been true collaboration. And if the white women had fully embraced Black women's concerns 100, 150 years ago, if our landscape socially and culturally might have been different today. And people have asked me, well, isn't that that's easy to suggest with a hindsight of 2020, 100 years later, right? And I don't think that it's that unreasonable to suggest there actually, during the abolitionist movement, Black women and white women worked collaboratively together. There was a falling out early on in the history, and then particularly as the suffrage movement started focusing on the South, they had a Southern strategy. And there was racist rhetoric on both sides of the movement. And many arguing that if you gave women the right to vote, that meant giving Black women also the right to vote, and that would upset white supremacy. And many of the white women suffragists, they did not disavow that. They either embraced that racist rhetoric, or they tiptoed around it. And those are all things that we need to reconcile 100 years later. Because some of that still goes on. It plays out in how we engage with others, right? History impacts us for a long time.
Well, I want to turn to the 19th Amendment Project, which Burning Coal is co-producing with the League of Women Voters, and I'm very excited about this project, Jerry. Tell me what the impetus for the project was initially, because this, Jerry, this has been in the works for a long time prior to COVID. So talk to me about the original idea about that you had for this project.
Sure. Let me start by saying Wi-Fi connection seems a little unstable, so if I freeze up, just wave at me and I'll stop talking for a moment till it comes back. Diana came to me. She approached me in the lobby of our theater, if I'm remembering right, probably about a year and a half or 2 years ago. I don't remember what the play was that she had come to see, but when it was over, she grabbed me and said, told me who she was and what she was involved with, what organization she was involved with, and asked if we were interested in creating something to commemorate the 100th anniversary. And this is something we've done a number of times throughout our history. For instance, about 5 years ago, the two First Baptist churches in downtown Raleigh. You may not know, Lauren, that there are two in downtown Raleigh. One is black and one is white, and they're sort of catty-cornered across the Capitol grounds from each other. But 200 years ago, they were the same church. They had a single congregation, and it wasn't until the Civil War era that they split. And for one reason or another, they never rejoined each other. But they asked us to create a piece that commemorated their founding, their 200-year history. And so, we've done that with a number of organizations. And it's something that interests me, honestly. History is something that I don't know what else theater is really than history. Really, it's the stories that we tell about things that have happened, or maybe sometimes things that might happen. But when Diana asked me about that, I said, absolutely. Do you have any ideas? And she said, no, why don't you think about it and let me know what you come up with. And it just occurred to me that, originally before the pandemic, it was going to be a live production. We were going to have a two-night event because we had so darn many playwrights who said yes to us when we asked. But when the pandemic came along, then it became clear to me that, it's one thing to do a play that has, 14 different short plays in it. It's another thing to do 14 short films and make them different and interesting. And I didn't know how we could do that at Burning Coal. So at that point, the idea of collaborating with other arts organizations from the Triangle and a couple of them beyond that came into my mind. And we also have a history of doing that from the past. And so I married these ideas in my mind and went back to Diana, and she liked the idea of all this. And so, it's been a pretty smooth process from that point on.
So it's pretty extraordinary. There's 14 playwrights, 14 plays that will begin to be rolled out on August 17th. But after they're rolled out, they will be available to watch online through the end of September. And Diana, the League of Women Voters, is having its own watch party sometime in September as well. So if you're a member, you could participate in that event. What were the parameters or guidelines for these short plays, Jerry? How are the playwrights selected, and what were the parameters for the plays?
Well, as we spoke about before the interview began, Kelly Doyle, who's one of the playwrights, one of the 14 playwrights, she's a local person. She lives in Raleigh, and she has a very strong background. She was educated at Brown University, received her MFA in playwriting at Brown, which is the preeminent writers' school in the country, I think. And so she had a lot of connections in that world. And so we put together a list together, and many of them she had personal connections with. And so that gave us an entree into, it basically got our emails returned. And then we talked to the playwrights and we told them, this is the broad subject. We want you to write about something within that broad subject that is of interest to you. And that was kind of it. We told them we wanted it to stay in the 10-minute range, more or less. And like all good artists, they ignored me on that. No, just kidding. But some of them are a little bit longer, but they're in the ballpark of that. And so, I think it represents a broad range of ideas about not just about the 19th Amendment project, but about, not just about the 19th Amendment, but about all that has come since then. in our country's history. It was a landmark. It was something that had to happen in order for progress to be made. But progress never seems to come wholly. You know, it always seems to come in fits and starts, especially in the good old USA. So, so I think you're going to find I think by watching the whole series, you'll get a good idea of how people think about that 100-year history, how artists think about that 100-year history, and how women think about that 100-year history, which is really the primary goal.
And there's a lot of interesting, these aren't just 14 plays about the suffragette movement. These are 14 plays that span history from medieval times to modern days. You know, and that's what's so interesting is all of their different takes on this issue.
And one of them is an opera too. So, so yeah, we're even stepping out of the theater box a little bit there. One of them is a canto, which is a particular way of writing. And, you know, there are comedies, there are dramas, there are poetic pieces, and they're sung through opera, literally an opera piece that the North Carolina Opera is helping us with, which I'm particularly excited about because their reach is pretty extensive, and the audience that supports them are people that I love. I love the idea of their audience listening to these stories and thinking about these ideas.
And it's a bargain. The plays, you can watch them individually for $2. You can watch all 14 for $25. So it's a deal. It's a deal. What I love about Burning Coal, you know, I think every theater company has its own distinct personality. And what I love about Burning Coal and what I think Burning Coal just does so darn well is the history play, the history play genre. Whether it's Shakespeare or whether it's a contemporary history play, I think you guys have it down pat. Can you talk to me, Jerry, a little bit about the evolution of the history play as a genre and how it contributes to how we remember history, how we interpret history?
Sure, that's a broad topic. You know, there's a saying that journalism is the first draft of history, and art is the final draft, and I think that's a fairly accurate way of thinking about.
You're coming in and out, Jerry.
Things as far as that are extant. Okay. Yeah, there's the little signal.
I can you kind of copy there for a second. So
the earliest plays that we know about, you know, the ones that have stood the test of time are plays about wars that happened and the gods and what the gods did to people who dared to step out of line and that sort of thing. If you go back to the Greek era, and then of course when you get into the Elizabethan age in the English-speaking theater, Shakespeare dominates, and a lot of his plays were written for specific, you know, to communicate specific ideas, whether it was to kiss up to the royalty, which he did frequently, or to tell stories that the people understood, but the royals may have missed. You know, Moliere did that too. Moliere was, you know, on the payroll of Louis, but he would sneak in plays like Tartuffe, you know, where he'd end it with the king coming in and saving the day, but the rest of the play was a condemnation of certain aspects of their culture, and so he was able to sneak those by the king by kissing up to him, really, and so I think you know, that is, you know, the way in which the history plays have progressed. often it was a matter of self-defense. The writers were not telling the story quite as directly, perhaps, as it should have been told, but they were finding ways to do it. When we look at more totalitarian states in the 20th century or the late 19th century, we see writers who would often use those same tactics. Often it's comedy, and so it's the history plays are really. I really do believe what I said earlier. I think all theater on some level is history. I was not a particularly good student in school, but my senior year I got straight A's in history class, and I didn't particularly try any harder than any other class. But I asked my mother one day. I said, "Why did that happen? Why do you think?" And she rolled her eyes and said, "Jerry, you look at those history books as little plays. You see them as characters, and you think of it as theater." And I thought, well, damn it, she's right again, and so history has always been a part of it's always been something that's interested me. As a child, I used to thumb through the encyclopedias, reading the stories about some philosopher or some king or queen or somebody who invented something. Those kinds of people interested me, and to this day, most of the books that I read are either biography or nonfiction stories. I'm always curious to understand, and I think most human beings are. I think we have a desire to understand how people survived, really. And the thing about human beings is that we're kind of born into this world alone, and we go out alone, and during most of the time we're here, we don't really know what's going on very much. We don't know how we got here. We don't know what we're supposed to do. We don't know whether we're doing it right. And so to learn about how other people thought and did is important. And I think it's particularly important in the realm of politics, which has such a vast influence on the lives of the citizens of a given country. And so the 19th Amendment project is a particularly important story for us as citizens of this country to try to understand as much as we can.
I agree. And there feels like, I guess one of the reasons I've become so enthralled by this project is there feels like there's such an immediacy to the work and an urgency to this project, to this work. So that's why I'm so committed to helping promote it. I want everybody to vote. I want everybody to get informed and educated. And if the gateway is theater to get them excited about that, then the gateway is going to be theater.
So, yeah.
Diana, I want to ask you from an advocacy standpoint. I think there is definitely a connection, a parallel between art and activism, the social justice and art. And I know you have a lot of, when I looked at the League of Women Voters for Wake County website, there are several events around the arts, whether it's with a graffiti artist or at Meredith College with their original works that they're doing, or with this 19th Amendment project. There seems to be a lot of cross-section between the arts and activism. So how do the arts play a role in social justice and activism?
I can only give you my personal opinion, and certainly people far more knowledgeable than I am have written and spoken about the important role of the arts in political activism and communicating the issues of the day. So the activities that you noticed on our website involve a gentleman is doing a book to document and discuss a lot of the mural art throughout downtown Raleigh, in particular, a lot of the graffiti art that went up during and after many of the Black Lives Matters protests. Those are all really important parts of activism. It is another outlet for expression. And often it's through the media of the various arts that a point can be made that is more poignant or is made clearer, at least on an emotional level, or sparks the thought, deeper thought about an issue, or about the history of something within our lives. And so when Jerry talks about, the history plays, the 19th Amendment is rich in history, and we also have gaps in the history. So there were people who were marginalized, and it's older history, so there are things that are just not included in the archives. And so as I read through the synopses of many of these plays, what I'm seeing is performing artists and playwrights telling stories that make fill in the gaps that we might imagine could have happened during some of these times, that tell the stories from different perspectives. So remember, the people who write the history books are very different people than the people who create graffiti art, for example. And so you don't get a complete history or review on an issue, I think, without the arts being an important part of that. I mean, it's why you see historically that artists of all types have come under fire when you have political turmoil, right? To silence artists because they're telling stories in one way or another.
Absolutely. If there was, I know when I read the synopses of these plays, there are several historical figures that these writers are including as characters in their play. Um, I feel like some of these plays are going to, some audience members may have a familiarity with some of these plays, Jerry. I think because, I just saw Camelot at Burning Coal, and Guinevere is one of the characters in one of these plays, which I'm very excited about. Carrie Knowles' play. People who saw Ash in Johannesburg last season, will be familiar with Hannah Benitez's work. She's writing one of these plays, so I'm very excited about that. But in your study of the suffragette movement, Diana, if there were any historical figures that you could sit down and have a dinner party with, who might those
Oh
be?
my goodness. I would probably go back to the older ones, the ones that people think of, like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, often referred to or considered the mothers of the movement. But I think we need to know more of the stories and understand the important role that people like Ida B. Wells played in the movement. And one of the plays speaks to part of that history. And also some of the men in the movement. Frederick Douglass was a very early suffragist. So obviously we think of him as a man who fought for abolition and racial equity, but he was a very early and very consistent, outspoken women's suffragist. Those are the people I would love to go back and hear their very different perspectives on the movement, and wonder what they would say about circumstances now 100 years after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Is it what they would have envisioned?
How about you, Jerry? Who's at your dinner party historical figures from the suffragists from this time period movement or this time period?
Well, I want to answer that in a roundabout sort of way and tie it together with something that Diana just said that I think is really important, and that is that idea about gaps in history. Um, the people I would like to hear from are the ones that we haven't heard from, that we don't know about, and that is a problem I think that is becoming more and more exacerbated. People have the internet now, and so they think that gives them something of a voice. But the truth is that, we have, for instance, in our country, the major media in our country are owned and operated by 6 companies right now. And it used to be dozens and dozens. And so all of the news that we're getting, right, the first draft of history is coming from a very thin sliver of society. And if you couple that with the rapid expansion of that gulf between the haves and the have-nots, the 1% and the 99%, which has been particularly exacerbated during the pandemic, when the billionaires, the 40 or 50 billionaires in our country have gotten, wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, and everybody else is losing their jobs and losing their health care and all of that. When you put those two things together, it creates a sense that that fewer and fewer people are getting any sort of voice at all in telling the narrative that is our collective story. And of course, the ones who will suffer the most from that are the ones in the previously underrepresented groups. And so the people I'd like to have at the dinner party are the ones that never learned to write because there was no education system for them, that died early because there was no healthcare system to support them, that were enslaved, or that economically simply had no idea that their voice could mean anything. And so that's who I'd like to hear from. I want to sit around a campfire with some of those people and hear their stories from the last 100 years.
Absolutely. I think there are so many interesting historical figures that we could learn so much from if we would just stop and pause and learn about them. So hopefully this series of plays will educate people or at least be a springboard for people to want to do more research. Um, Jerry, you were the very first podcast guest I ever interviewed on the RDU on Stage podcast. We were
And
talking
you kept doing it too.
I kept doing it because I'm crazy. Apparently, I just keep doing podcasts. But
where to go but up.
and we at that time, it's kind of interesting. It's full circle moment. We were talking about Ash in Johannesburg and Hannah Benitez's play, and I asked you at that time. So I'm going to ask you again. Now, what role does theater have in affecting social change? Because I feel like these are plays this is work you're very passionate about.
There's a great story that I love to tell that involves the playwright David Edgar, who's a British playwright. He's a bit of a friend of mine. He had a big success in the early 1980s with Nicholas Nickel.
Mm-hmm. Jerry, I'm going to stop you for 1 second because I'm losing you.
He did a big 8-hour-long adaptation of Nicholas Nickleby that the oh darn, right in the middle of my story. Can you hear me now or no?
Now I can hear you.
Okay, so David won the Tony Award for Nicholas Nickleby. It was very successful. It was filmed for PBS. And when it was shown on PBS, it was seen by many millions of people. And an interviewer asked him shortly after that, they said, "You must be elated because now your play has been seen by a lot more people than could ever see it in the theater." And he said, "No, I prefer when it's seen by people in the theater." And the guy said, "Well, how can that be when the numbers are so different?" And he said, "Because when you're in the theater, you're with a group of people and you're seeing it as part of a community. But when you're in your own home, you're at your most reactionary, and so less likely to experience the true impact of theater. And I think that's true of all art forms. I mean, I suppose novelists write things that are meant to be read in privacy, but most art forms, certainly the performing arts, are meant to be experienced collectively, and there's power to that. And it is why, Diane referenced earlier that idea of art being attacked whenever societies shift toward the totalitarian. Art is one of the first things that gets shut down or cut out, and the reason for that is that it has a magnified impact on the viewer, I think. So yeah, I think it is important. I also like to say I wouldn't, sorry, my phone's going off. I also like to say I wouldn't have spent my whole life working in this field if I didn't think it was important. But all aspects of society are important, whether it's the farmer or the the people who sell the farmer's product, or the people who provide jobs for large swaths of society. All of those things are important, but the arts are abstract at their best. I think they tell stories and they ask people to think about those stories, and how those stories relate to their stories. You don't go to see, to pick a history play, Henry V. You don't go to see Henry V to think about a king that lived 400 and something years ago, a battle he fought on a field, and to think about today, and perhaps our military exploits, and so there's an abstract quality to art that makes it particularly profound and resonant, and really causes the viewer, especially if they start at a young age, to think of the world that way. In other words, it engenders empathy.
I agree. And that's what I love about theater so much, is I think it teaches us, somebody I interviewed once said, it teaches us to flex the empathy muscle, which I love. Do you think these virtual plays, these virtual experiences that we're seeing so much of, are going to help or hurt theaters in the long run, Jerry?
I don't think they'll hurt the theater. I think they're placeholders, quite honestly. I'm trying to think of a comparison. I can't come up with a good one right now, but it's not the same. It has, the most valuable aspect of theater, and I would rank, place it above cinema, even although I love cinema, is the relationship between the actor and the audience. Is variable, is flexible, and when you watch a two-dimensional thing like the thing that we're doing right now, for instance, that none of us are ever going to jump off the screen and join you there in your living room. You probably wouldn't want us to anyway, but that's not going to happen, and so there's a certain facade that's up. But when you're in a theater, you're in the same room with the other artists and the other audience as well. That you're there together, I guess, is the right idea, and that's how empathy is created, an understanding that we're in the same room, breathing the same air, having the same experiences. I could go on and on about the proscenium stage and how much I dislike it because of this very issue, but I don't think that's quite on topic for tonight. So we'll save that for another time.
Another night. and coming to Burning Coal, it's not a proscenium. Yeah, that's one of the reasons. It's definitely and it feels like an immersive experience. Diana, where can people get involved with the League of Women Voters? Are you looking for members? How do people join the organization and become involved?
So we're an all volunteer organization. We have no paid staff, and our members operate the organization at all levels. So it's our members who are encouraging people to register to vote. It's our members who are educating people on how to get an absentee ballot and how that process is going to work. And for members who want to be engaged in advocacy work, then our members join the committees addressing those issues, including issues like redistricting, affordable housing, women's rights, certainly, issues impacting the environment, and certainly issues related to voting rights. You can join the League of Women Voters of Wake County by going to lwvwake.org, and you can join there. There is a membership fee of $60 for an individual member. I will note that if you are a high school or a college student and you want to join the League of Women Voters of Wake County, that is a free membership. And again, you can join online. And if you have people who are outside of Wake County, they can go to the State League's website, LWVNC, and that will tell you whether you have a League of Women Voters in your county. So for example, in an adjacent county, we have the League of Women Voters of Orange, Durham, and Chatham County. We have a league in Granville. We have the Twin Counties League in Edgecombe and Nash. The League of Women Voters of Wake County encompasses Johnston County and any other nearby county where there isn't a league. We have an endless list of opportunities for volunteers. So if somebody really wants a place to get engaged with the political process and learn a lot about government and the processes, then we encourage you to join the league.
Absolutely. And I know there was a lot of excitement around the Biden announcement today. And I know for my mother called and said, I'm going to volunteer. And so this is a good place to start and to volunteer no matter what side of the party lines you're on. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining me. Jerry, Diana, I am so excited about these plays. Like I said, I've spent the last few days interviewing the playwrights, and I will be putting those podcast episodes out later this month. I may be putting them out on other platforms other than RDU on Stage, and I'll keep you guys posted on that. But I think it's a marvelous project, and I hope everybody will support it. And the takeaway is watch these plays, order your absentee ballot, whether you plan to vote absentee or not. At least you'll have it, right, Diana?
That's right. Yeah, you have a plan.
And look into volunteering and joining the league. Thank you both so much. I so appreciate this. The plays roll out next week, right, Jerry?
Yeah, Monday the 17th is the first night.
And I think the second night is Claire Bailey's play. She did The Container. She wrote The Container, which we saw last season or earlier this year. So there's a lot of playwrights people will be familiar with.
We've got a great, can I just say, we've got a great number of theaters and groups, not just North Carolina Opera, but also Raleigh Little Theater, the North Carolina Theater, the Justice Theater Project, the Women's Theater Festival, Raleigh Little Theater. I think I said we've got a ton of really great groups that are helping us do this. And so if you're a fan of any of those organizations, you may be will be interested in this as well.
Absolutely. Well, support local theaters, support all these great artists, and get out and vote. So thank you both. Thank you, Jerry, for that. And I will put a list of theaters along with the links to where people can find the play in the notes after this. So thank you both so much. Tomorrow night, we are doing a premiere watch party. Last week, Juan Isler interviewed a really fascinating Judge Nelson A. Diaz, and it was a fascinating interview. So please stay tuned for that. And then Thursday, Juan will be back live with another Torn panel. So we've got a full week of events planned. I hope you'll join us. Thanks so much, both of you, and have a good night. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Good night.